Okay, so we're going to be looking at section, again, 44, plucking of corn, and this section is going to deal with the authority of the Pharisees in the application of the law versus that of Jesus, who is the Lord of the Sabbath. So in question 248, we read, "What concern did the Pharisees have over Jesus and his disciples plucking the wheat kernels to eat?" So what do we think the answer to that is?
C.
Yes, C. Okay, they were not adhering to the Pharisees' interpretation of the law. Okay. All right, so we see here the idea that Jesus and his disciples were not adhering to what Moses had given in the law brings into question the nature of interpretation. Okay, the fact that or just this idea itself. Okay, so ambiguity is a peculiar problem of language. Okay, and it's the use of words that could be interpreted a variety of ways. And we have an example here. For instance, if I said that I had buried $100 in a bank, the first thing you probably would think of is that I put $100 in an account at, let's say, the First Savings and Loan Association, and then, forgot about it. Or perhaps you could think, and you might think, that I took a shovel and went down to the river, dug a hole in the shoreline, put $100 in the hole, and covered it up. Okay, so, bank has more than one meaning, and depending on how it's worded and, context and everything, it could have more than one meaning. So anyway, in order to render a judgment about anything, we often rely on understanding the definitions of what we are talking about. Words have meanings. Does that come as a shock to anybody here? Okay. So obviously, the more critical the issue, the more precise our definitions must be. So for example, in a contract, words have specific meanings, and lawyers work to set up the terms of a contract to not allow for ambiguities that would nullify the contract. Okay, in The Merchant of Venice, which some of us may be familiar with, Shylock demands that the terms of a contract require his rival Antonio to forfeit a pound of flesh, which he had put up for security in a loan that he had defaulted on. Okay, Shylock wins his case and may have his pound of flesh, but not a drop of blood. So this becomes the turning point that causes Shylock to lose everything. So the more critical the issue, the more safeguards are put in place to define terms. This has led to great debates, especially in modern times, on the very nature of meaning in language. Okay, this comes into play a lot in Bible translations. We are probably aware of that, dynamic equivalence versus literal and verbal equivalence. Okay, anyway, language often depends on the context in which it is used. For example, for a physicist, work means force times distance. For an artist, work means expression and presentation. For a philosopher, it means mental exertion. For a contractor, it means production. For someone exercising, it means mere physical exertion. So each of these might raise an eyebrow to hear the others talk about work. So everybody has an idea or an interpretation of what work is. So this brings us back to the Pharisees, who had the peculiar problem of how to define work. In their attempt to be unambiguous and unassailable, they developed understandings of the term work that led to questionable interpretations. We have the same problem today where lawmakers write laws and then leave the interpretation to regulatory agencies who take advantage of the ambiguities of the law to pile up burdensome regulations that overprotect the public and stifle business and social activity. And we've probably all experienced some kind of rule, regulation, or law that somebody probably thought up with maybe even good intentions, but somehow along the line it just became something, it became used for something that was not its original purpose. So the Pharisees would claim that they were merely applying what was written in the law as an answer A, okay, but in reality they were applying their interpretations of the law as an answer C. They did not care about the obvious use of the law, or the spirit of the law, or what the law was intended for. The law is pretty clear, except when it is laden with over-examination. So the law was given to protect workers from being overworked, and what started as a guarantee for rest turned into a burdensome and contradictory control of people. Okay, walking on stilts and walking with a peg leg would both be work according to a physicist, but the Pharisees treated each differently. And we're going to see more about that in the next questions. Okay, so what did Jesus use first to illustrate the significance of the spirit of the law? Let's take a look at Mark 2:25, chapter 2, verses 25 to 26. And he said unto them, Have ye never read what David did when he had need and was an hungered, he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat but for the priests, and gave also to them which were with him. Okay, so which did Jesus use first to illustrate the significance of the spirit of the law? This one might have been a little bit more tricky.
I think B.
Okay, B.
I don't know. I didn't look at the answer.
You didn't look at the answers.
No, I didn't.
Okay, that's good. Okay, yes. In fact, the correct answer is indeed B. How that derivatives of the law did not have the same significance as the law, since David was given the consecrated showbread once it had served its purpose. So we see here that Jesus pointed out how their arguments lacked elegance. That is, the Pharisees' interpretations raised more questions than it did explanations. Okay, answer A is wrong. Okay, how that the law was not to be taken to extreme observance since David was given the consecrated showbread once it had served its purpose. Okay. So A is wrong because how the law was to be applied was not according to the degree that we feel is reasonable. Extreme application of a law might help us to gain perspective, such as in not killing, but there are limitations to this law because it really only covers murder. So even here, there is a problem between, let's say, accidental homicide, and then we have anger or heat of the moment, and then we have premeditated murder. So, and the Bible does actually break some of these things down as well. Okay, and in our law, there would be things like manslaughter and just other degrees. Okay, so the problem using extreme applications with all of these, which are covered in the law, is that the application of the law becomes subjective to what each person considers extreme. So there's a similar problem with C also. The law is not to be applied to subjective interpretation, and the key word here is subjective. There are objective standards to be applied that include examining the law in the context of the whole Bible and the circumstances that are presented. God had set up judges to be able to give consideration to all factors involved. When one person alone judges, there's a greater possibility of unwarranted subjectivity. So the difference between B and the other answers, B being the correct answer, is that the Pharisees had set up new laws that people were judged by. Using just the original law allowed a flexibility to be able to judge appropriately. In Proverbs 11:14 we read, "Where no counsel is, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety." Okay, so the danger of codifying the derivatives of the law is that the subjectivity that was used to arrive at the derivative law is now embedded in the law itself. Okay, so by raising the question of David eating the showbread, Jesus forced the Pharisees to have to reconsider the derivative laws that they had created. Remember, this is not God's law anymore. This is their interpretation of the law and their add-ons. The body of case law that they had established is necessarily less authoritative than the original source law. Although case law can be very helpful and powerful, it is still subject to being overturned. For example, the U.S. Supreme Court has overruled more than 200 of its precedents that had been set in other cases. So Jesus did not challenge the significance of the law, just the significance of the derivative laws made by the Pharisees. And there's a big difference there. Okay, the original scripture is God's law. Everything else was just what the Pharisees and the other religious leaders had added on to it. And Jesus calls them out on this numerous times. Okay. Anybody, any questions or any thoughts so far? Okay.
The law itself,
I'm sorry, the what?
the law that's being disputed here is on the law of Sabbath.
I'm sorry, say that again. The
The,
law being
the
disputed
Sabbath,
here?
not
The
no
Sabbath.
work, no work on the Sabbath.
Yeah, that's basically what's
and
happening
they
here.
made the Pharisees made it so burdensome that they defined specific work. Like even the picking of corn, it would be work. But then there are principles laid down by the scripture by which you can make a decision that it doesn't really violate the Sabbath law, because it says there, for example, in 1 Samuel 21 verses 1 to 6, human need is more important than religious ritual. And then in Deuteronomy, mere gleaning, this is Deuteronomy 23 to verse 24 to 25, gleaning is not stealing. In other words, there's a human need in question. When that's why Jesus made an illustration about David being in dire need, and then the ritual, ceremonial law,
Right.
would not override a basic principle of life.
Right, and I mean, they ate on the Sabbath, so somebody had to prepare the food and things like that. So, I mean, there were still things that were going on that wouldn't be considered violating the Sabbath, and we're actually going to take a look into that in other perspectives as well. Okay, very good. So in question number 250, how did Jesus demonstrate the practicality of the law when it came to the priests of the temple? Okay, in Matthew 12:5 we read, "Or have ye not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" So how did Jesus demonstrate the practicality of the law when it came to the priests of the high temple? Okay, A, they had to work on the Sabbath and in the temple, and so not all work could be against the law. Okay, so again, getting back to what Brother Tone said, that there's some type of work that had to be done on the Sabbath. The priests had to fulfill their role and do what they needed to do. When you were in the house, women would be, I guess, preparing the meals and things like that. So, today we would, consider that housework or, household chores, cooking, cleaning, etc., etc. So, it is a type of work, okay, but it's still not violating the law. Okay, so there's no specific scripture that talks about how the priests did not profane the Sabbath by their priestly work. Jesus is pointing out a truth that is based on the absence of scripture. For all the passages that describe the work of the priests, there is never any reference to them being judged for their labors. So Jesus is referring to the practice of the priests. By pointing out the practical nature of the law, Jesus highlights the significance of the spirit of the law, or what the significance of the intention of the law was. Okay, so answer B is wrong because there's no exemption from the law working on the Sabbath that was written into the law. Jesus is pointing out that the law was commonly understood to refer to a more general sense of rest for people from their labors. Okay, and C is obviously wrong and highlights the hypocrisy, especially in our modern times, of how lawmakers will make laws and policies but write in exemptions for themselves. Exceptions to the law should be based on realistic needs, not privileged position. So, especially in our modern times, of how lawmakers will make laws and policies but write in exemptions for themselves, kind of like putting restrictions on Thanksgiving travel and then traveling on Thanksgiving, or going to posh restaurants in large gatherings with no masks on, but telling everybody else that they can't do that. Not that that would happen. I'm just using that as illustration. Or did that happen?
He did that when he told them not to go go to the beach, anyway.
Yeah, I know. Actually, that did happen. That happened. The governor of California did it. I think one of the mayors in California did it. So, yeah, again, as they say, rules for thee, but not for me. See, they can use Bible language when they want to. All right. So anyway, any questions there or any thoughts there? Okay, moving on then to question number 251. How is Jesus greater than the temple? And we can find our answer in Matthew chapter 12, verses 6 and 8. But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. Okay, so how is Jesus greater than the temple? B. Jesus was Lord of the Sabbath, who determines the administration of each dispensation. Okay, and who can remind me or refresh what is a dispensation? An age and a period of time with different responsibilities. Man has different responsibilities toward God. Okay, so Jesus was not claiming to be merely holier than the priests of the temple, as in A. He was claiming to be greater than the temple itself. The issue of even greater significance was the claim that Jesus made about being the Lord of the Sabbath. Having referenced David eating the showbread of the tabernacle and the work of the priests in the temple, Jesus is claiming even greater authority since he is greater than the temple. As a law-respecting Jew and law-fulfilling Messiah, Jesus would not have made changes to the law at all, let alone do so arbitrarily as in answer C. So as Messiah, Jesus was the best judge of what the law meant, which would apply then and now in this dispensation. This is markedly true when we consider that the requirements of the law being fulfilled in Jesus make many practices of the law defunct. With regard to the Sabbath today, there are those who use Sabbath worship as a test for salvation. Those who worship on some other day are considered to be identified with the Antichrist. Does anybody know who that we're talking about here, which group that is? That is the Seventh-day Adventists, and that is correct. Okay, in Colossians 2:16-17, we read, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat, or in drink, or in respect of an holy day, or the new moon, or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ." So that would speak against that idea. Okay, so Christians were noted for worshiping on the Lord's Day, breaking bread, on the first day of the week, and so it was a common practice of the church to meet on Sundays. If God had meant it to be on the Sabbath, he would have said so, but the change was made to the Lord's Day. This would be in recognition of the fact that Jesus rose from the grave the first day of the week. Okay, in Romans 14:5 and 6, we read, "One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regardeth the day, regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day, to the Lord he doth not regard it. He that eateth, eateth to the Lord, for he giveth God thanks, and he that eateth not, to the Lord he eateth not, and giveth God thanks." Okay, so there's a lot of things that were being considered in that passage, but speaking here about the law. Okay, any questions or thoughts about that? Okay, then let's move on to our final question in this section. Question number 252, what is an underlying principle of the law that Jesus emphasized? And we can see our answer in Matthew 12:7 and Mark 2:27. Matthew 12:7 reads, "But if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless." And in Mark 2:27, and he said unto them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." Okay, so what is an underlying principle of the law that Jesus emphasized? C. Mercy and blessing. Okay. Okay. Hosea 6:6. Okay. All right. So Answer A highlights how rules are not supposed to be made arbitrarily as a means to test people so there can be a reason to punish them. Okay, rules are made for practical purposes in order to achieve efficiency in reaching goals. They are meant to be helpful, providing mercy, protecting laborers, and to be a blessing. In this case, protecting laborers. You know, basically, when God makes rules, a lot of people look at God as some cosmic spoil sport who just doesn't want anybody to have a good time. But when God makes rules, he makes prohibitions and things of that sort. Basically, what it's saying is, don't do that. You'll hurt yourself. Don't do that. Just like when you tell your child, don't touch the stove. He's going to look at you and go, oh, she never lets me have any fun. So you leave the kitchen and 2 seconds later, you hear the kid screaming, you know, what did he do? He touched the stove. What'd you tell him? Don't touch the stove. You'll hurt yourself. Same idea when God gives us some rules about prohibiting something. It's like, don't do that. You're going to hurt yourself. You know, so we have to trust the way a young child should, as we as young children should trust our parents to know what's best for us. And of course, parents are not perfect, but God is perfect, and he knows truly what's best for us. He created us. Okay. Anyway, however, God's law was not given for one age and is able to be abandoned according to man's changing values, as in B. Okay. The Bible is not a living document to be interpreted whatever way we want as times change. Okay. So the law is a reflection of the character of God, and what determines sin from one culture or age to the next is not subject to man's popular opinion. This is why people have issue with the Bible, and they say, oh, it's an old-fashioned book. It doesn't have meaning for us today. Actually, the Bible is more up to date than tomorrow's newspaper. All right. Anyway, Jesus pointed out the purpose of the law as a benefit for man by emphasizing the character of mercy the law was supposed to have. You know, if we all followed God's laws, this world would be a better place, and most of the problems, I won't say all of them, but most of the problems that we see around would disappear pretty quickly. All right.